At 8:15 on the freezing morning of December 19, 1944, Sergeant William "Buck" Anderson pressed himself against the snow-covered ground of a Belgian forest while nearly 300 German troops slowly tightened the ring around his isolated unit. Anderson was 31 years old, a lifelong elk hunter from Montana with 6 confirmed kills already credited to his name. Around him, the exhausted survivors of Easy Company, only 40 men left, were trapped deep in the Ardennes after the German winter offensive had shattered American lines. Ammunition was running dangerously low, escape routes had vanished, and German forces held them pinned inside a frozen clearing. The men around Anderson doubted him from the beginning. His company commander considered his shooting methods a waste of precious ammunition. The platoon sergeant argued that firing at single targets from hundreds of yards away would only expose their position. Several soldiers mocked the idea that a Montana hunter could teach infantrymen how to survive a siege. Earlier that morning, when Anderson proposed his plan, Captain James Walsh asked if he had finally lost his mind. Anderson calmly explained that he had spent more than 15 years hunting elk across the mountains of Montana, regularly making shots at extreme range in brutal wind conditions. Walsh dismissed the comparison immediately, insisting that combat and hunting had nothing in common. Even so, Anderson kept his rifle close. German troops advanced carefully through the forest, launching probing attacks and studying American positions. They remained between 350 and 400 yards away, far enough to stay beyond the effective range of most American rifles. At least, that was what they believed. Anderson carried something different. While the rest of the company used standard M1 Garands, Anderson had kept his 1903 Springfield fitted with a unertl scope. The rifle was capable of accurate fire at 600 yards, and Anderson had spent years in Montana mountains making difficult 500-yard shots on moving elk through shifting winds. Compared to elk in rugged terrain, German soldiers moving through snow seemed like easier targets. Easy Company had been pushing through the Ardennes on December 18 when the German assault erupted without warning. Tanks, artillery, and infantry from the German 6th SS Panzer Army slammed into American positions, collapsing sections of the front. Units became separated in the chaos. By nightfall, Easy Company found itself isolated 2 miles behind German lines. 40 men remained alive, several were wounded, radio contact was gone, and ammunition reserves were thin. That evening, Captain Walsh gathered the survivors to decide their fate. They had only 2 choices: attempt a breakout through enemy territory while carrying wounded men, or hold their ground and pray American reinforcements arrived before the Germans destroyed them. Walsh chose to stay put. The company dug defensive positions, rationed ammunition, and waited. Anderson still carried the Springfield he had brought from training despite repeated complaints from Walsh. The rifle weighed 8 pounds 12 ounces, and the large scope added another pound. The standard Garand used by every other soldier weighed slightly more but lacked magnification. Anderson's rifle was bolt action with only 5 rounds at a time, while the Garand was semi-automatic and carried 8. Walsh had ordered Anderson more than once to abandon the hunting rifle and take standard equipment instead. Anderson ignored him every time. He had grown up in Livingston, Montana, where his father operated a hunting guide service in the Absaroka Range. Anderson began hunting elk at 16 years old, and by the age of 20 he was already making successful shots beyond 500 yards. Years of hunting taught him how to judge wind, compensate for elevation, control breathing, and wait patiently for a perfect opportunity. At dawn on December 19, the Germans arrived in force. Roughly 300 enemy soldiers established positions in a semicircle around the clearing where Easy Company waited. The distance averaged about 400 yards, ideal for German machine guns and mortars, but too far for most American riflemen. At 7 a.m., German probing attacks began. Small squads moved carefully toward the American perimeter, testing defenses. Walsh ordered his men not to fire until the enemy closed within 200 yards in order to conserve ammunition. The Germans advanced to roughly 250 yards before pulling back unharmed, having successfully identified American firing positions. At 7:30, German mortars opened fire. Explosions ripped through the clearing, wounding several Americans. Under the cover of mortar shells, German infantry advanced again, this time reaching around 300 yards. Walsh's men responded with guerrilla fire, inflicting casualties but failing to stop the pressure completely. The Germans withdrew once more after reaching approximately 250 yards. The pattern became obvious. The Germans would advance, absorb some losses, retreat, reorganize, and attack again. Eventually, sheer attrition would overwhelm Easy Company. Anderson watched the entire process from behind a fallen tree near the northern edge of the clearing. He had not fired a single shot yet. His Springfield held only 25 rounds total. Every bullet mattered. At 8:15, he approached Walsh with his idea. He wanted to eliminate German soldiers at long range, forcing the enemy to fear exposure and slowing the assault psychologically. Walsh argued that the tactic would waste ammunition and expose Anderson's location. Anderson pointed out that the Germans already knew exactly where the Americans were positioned. What they did not know was that someone could hit them accurately from nearly 400 yards away. Walsh finally agreed to give him until noon. If the tactic failed, Anderson would stop firing and conserve what remained of his ammunition. Anderson settled behind the fallen tree, stretched out prone in the snow. He rested the Springfield across the log and looked through the 8-power scope. German soldiers moved confidently between trees, setting up machine guns and speaking with officers. They believed themselves untouchable at that range. At 8:23, Anderson selected his first target. A German officer stood 380 yards away directing troops with broad hand gestures. Anderson studied him for half a minute, measuring the slight crosswind drifting from left to right. His rifle was sighted for 300 yards, so he adjusted mentally, aiming several inches high. He slowed his breathing. The Springfield's trigger broke crisply beneath his finger. The rifle cracked across the frozen forest. Through the scope, Anderson watched the officer collapse instantly into the snow. Nearby German soldiers threw themselves to the ground in confusion. Without panic, Anderson worked the bolt, chambered another round, and continued watching. The Germans shouted to one another in disbelief. Rifle fire from that distance was something they had not expected. At 8:41, Anderson spotted another target, a soldier sprinting between positions at roughly 410 yards. He led the moving target carefully and squeezed the trigger. The soldier dropped before reaching cover. 2 shots. 2 kills. Now the Germans understood they were no longer safe. At 9:02, Anderson eliminated a third German soldier attempting to emplace a machine gun at 395 yards. The enemy had assumed he stood outside American range. Anderson proved otherwise. By 9:30, he had fired 8 rounds. 6 had found their mark, 2 drifted wide because of wind. More importantly, the German advance had stalled completely. Enemy soldiers hesitated to move at all. Every time someone exposed himself, Anderson fired. Captain Walsh observed the battlefield through binoculars before turning toward Anderson in disbelief. "Can you keep doing this?" he asked. Anderson answered calmly that he still had 17 rounds remaining. If the Germans stayed at that distance, he could continue. Walsh ordered him to keep shooting. Eventually the Germans adjusted their tactics. They stopped crossing open ground whenever possible and relied on trees and smoke cover from artillery. But movement was still necessary, and every movement gave Anderson another opportunity. At 10:15, he killed a soldier attempting to flank the American perimeter through heavy brush at 425 yards. At 10:47, another German officer rose briefly from behind cover to organize an assault. Anderson shot him immediately. By 11 o'clock, Anderson had fired 14 rounds. 10 were confirmed hits. German offensive action had nearly ceased. Instead of attacking, enemy soldiers now hid in defensive positions of their own. The siege had effectively reversed itself. German troops were trapped psychologically, terrified to move forward and equally afraid to retreat across open ground under Anderson's rifle. Walsh finally asked how Anderson could make such impossible shots. Anderson explained it simply. Hunting elk in Montana required shooting uphill through shifting wind at moving animals. You learn to judge elevation, track movement, and wait patiently for the exact moment. Compared to that, German soldiers were easier targets, larger, slower, and more predictable. At 11:30, frustrated German artillery intensified its bombardment. Mortar shells exploded around Anderson's position as the enemy attempted to silence the sniper controlling the battlefield. Anderson calmly relocated 50 yards west, found fresh cover, and resumed firing. At 12:03, he shot a German soldier attempting to establish a mortar position at an extreme distance of 440 yards. Soon afterward, the Germans dispatched a 6-man patrol to hunt him down. The squad crept through thick forest undergrowth toward Anderson's sector. When they reached around 380 yards, Anderson killed the lead man instantly. The patrol scattered. Anderson dropped another soldier as he fled before the rest withdrew in panic. 13 kills. 12 rounds left. At 1:20 p.m., Anderson noticed renewed German movement south of the clearing. Enemy troops attempted to reposition and flank Easy Company from another direction. Through the scope, Anderson identified a German non-commissioned officer directing the maneuver from roughly 405 yards away. One shot. The NCO collapsed. The flanking attempt stopped immediately. By 2 p.m., Anderson had fired 20 rounds. 16 hits. 4 misses. The Germans had completely abandoned offensive operations. They stayed hidden in place, unwilling to risk further movement. Fear now controlled them. Somewhere in the woods, an invisible marksman dominated every approach. Walsh gathered his exhausted men together. The Germans had not attacked for 2 full hours. If the relief column reached them before nightfall, they might survive after all. Anderson's shooting had bought them that time. At 2:30 p.m., several German officers attempted to rally their men for another assault. Anderson watched them through the scope as they pointed toward American positions and shouted orders. He shot the first officer at 415 yards. 30 seconds later, he killed the second. The attack collapsed before it even began. 18 kills. 7 rounds remaining. At 3 p.m., the Germans launched one final effort. Artillery pounded the clearing while infantry advanced from multiple directions under covering fire. Walsh's men opened up with everything they had left. Anderson focused exclusively on enemy leaders. He killed one NCO at 390 yards. Another at 410. A third at 435 yards while the man attempted to organize troops behind cover. 21 kills. 4 rounds remained in the rifleman's ammunition pouch. The German attack finally broke apart at 300 yards under intense American resistance. Enemy soldiers retreated back into the forest. During the withdrawal, Anderson made the longest shot of the day, 445 yards, and dropped another German soldier in the snow. 22 kills. 3 rounds left. At approximately 4:30 p.m., distant American artillery thundered through the forest. The relief force was approaching. German troops heard it too. Almost immediately, they began pulling back before reinforcements trapped them. As the Germans withdrew, Anderson spotted one final officer directing the retreat at roughly 425 yards. He fired once more. The officer fell. Kill number 23. At 5 p.m., the first elements of the American relief column finally reached Easy Company. After 9 brutal hours, the siege was over. 40 Americans had survived against nearly 300 German troops. Anderson's rifle had shattered the assault. During the debriefing, Walsh showed the relief commander Anderson's firing position along with the 23 spent shell casings lying in the snow. The commander asked how many Germans Anderson had actually hit. Walsh estimated 18 confirmed kills, with every single shot either killing or wounding an enemy soldier. The commander asked Anderson how he managed accurate fire beyond 400 yards using a Springfield. Anderson answered simply. 15 years of elk hunting in Montana. Learning wind. Judging elevation. Controlling breathing. Waiting for one perfect shot. The commander immediately suggested Anderson transfer into a sniper unit. Anderson refused. He preferred staying with Easy Company. Easy Company remained in the Ardennes through January 1945, and Anderson fought in 6 additional engagements. By then, his confirmed kill count had risen to 31, all at distances beyond 350 yards using the same Springfield and scope. In February 1945, Division Headquarters ordered Anderson to attend sniper school as an instructor. For the next 3 months, he trained other soldiers in long-range marksmanship. Many had never hunted before. Anderson taught them the same lessons he learned in Montana: wind reading, elevation adjustment, breathing control, careful trigger squeeze, and patient target stalking. By May 1945, soldiers trained by Anderson had reportedly killed 147 German troops using his methods. Long-range precision fire became psychological warfare. Enemy soldiers became afraid to move at all. Anderson survived the war and received the Silver Star for his actions on December 19. The citation praised extraordinary marksmanship under siege conditions, though it never mentioned elk hunting. In November 1945, he returned home to Livingston, Montana, where he took over his father's hunting guide business. For the next 30 years, he guided elk hunters through the Absaroka Range. The Springfield rifle and scope hung above his fireplace the entire time. Whenever clients asked about the weapon, Anderson simply said he had carried it during the war. Nothing more. In 1977, a military historian researching small unit actions during the Battle of the Bulge discovered Easy Company's after-action reports describing Anderson's long-range shooting. The reports detailed 23 German casualties at extraordinary distances. The historian eventually located Anderson, now 64 years old and still guiding hunters in Montana. When questioned about December 19, Anderson confirmed the story but minimized his role. He insisted that any experienced elk hunter could have made those same shots because the principles never changed. An elk at 500 yards. A German soldier at 400. Judge the wind. Adjust for elevation. Squeeze the trigger. Wait. The historian later asked what Anderson had been thinking during those 6 relentless hours in the forest. Anderson replied that he had been remembering a bull elk he shot back in 1938 at 520 yards in a 10-mile wind. The calculations were identical. The patience was identical. The elk had actually been a more difficult target. William "Buck" Anderson died in 1995 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his military service and his decades as a hunting guide, but it never spoke of the 23 Germans killed in the Ardennes or the Springfield rifle that helped save 40 American soldiers. Eventually, Anderson's family donated the rifle and scope to the Montana Historical Society, where they remain displayed in a glass case in Helena. Most visitors walk past without noticing. Yet within U.S. Army sniper training programs, Anderson's engagement in the Ardennes is still studied as an example of how long-range precision fire can create complete psychological dominance over a battlefield. One accurate rifleman controlling 400 yards of terrain forced an entire enemy force into paralysis. A Montana elk hunter used 15 years of experience in the mountains to stop 300 German soldiers and save 40 Americans trapped in the Ardennes. Sometimes the most valuable combat skills are not learned on military training grounds. Sometimes they are learned alone in cold mountains, waiting patiently for the perfect shot.